This podcast is brought to you by HEC Paris.
Very glad to be here. Honored to be chosen as discussant for this paper. One of the reasons I enjoy this conference so very much and appreciate it so much is it combines two of my very favorite fields, statistics and finance. It's great to have them together like this. May I take a moment to thank the organizers, Laurent Calvert and Veronica Celler, for this wonderful program. Oh. Got to press the right buttons here, of course. There we go. Yeah, there it is. That's what I was expecting. So here's an outline of what I'll have to say. General comments and summary, some intuition for the infinite factor limit, talk about the yield curve factor structure of this model, give some speculation and extensions, which is always a fun part of the discussion, and conclude all in 10 minutes. So Calvert, Fisher, and Wu have created a term structure model that is tractable, very high dimensional. Can you say infinity? It's pretty high. While being arbitrage free, and that does not overfit. Now, personally, I find this somewhat of a paradox, that we have such great flexibility for yield curve modeling with many, many factors, even infinitely many, for the purpose of modeling the yield curve at a fixed time, while maintaining a parsimony of the model with few parameters. How do we have both of these at once? Well, it's because the few parameters control many parameters in the power cascade of the time horizons, and essentially because we've separated the parameters of the time evolution from the many factors of the fixed time yield curve structure. The time evolution of the yield curve is controlled by 5 parameters. I know sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 6. I'm fixing on the basic 4 plus the price of risk parameter, the risk neutral long-term measure, which in turn, these 5 parameters create n frequencies where n is arbitrarily large, logarithmically spaced, matching observed times. Very nice argument, very clever, I believe. They also create the n volatilities, the n prices of risk, while the yield curve itself at each time t is controlled by many, many factors. There's still a bit of a paradox, but at least we're starting to understand. It's trying to give you my intuition into how this works. I always worry about overfitting. And I want to give you an on the one hand, on the other hand discussion of overfitting. First of all, why should there be overfitting? The argument goes like this. With 15 parameters, that's a lot of parameters. The yield curve should suffer from overfitting. If you look at the average error of less than 1 basis point, that would seem to confirm that at least as a possibility. Of course, let me give you the other hand, because I don't want to leave you with that thought. Why do we find no overfitting? Which apparently we don't. The counter-argument goes like this. We're dealing with linear combinations of exponential functions. This is not a typical linear regression model with 15 parameters. This is a special construction. Near the optimal fit, my intuition about linear combinations of decaying exponentials is the objective function is very flat, and while the 15 parameters may be poorly determined in this flat region of the objective function, nonetheless, any choice from that flat region is going to produce yield curves that are all smooth and all close to the data. So it doesn't matter that the individual factor parameters, we're not calling them parameters, the individual factors are not well determined, because nonetheless they determine a smooth, reasonable yield curve. The no arbitrage condition acts on the yield curve, not on the individual parameters factor specification of the yield curve. So again, all this sort of conspires to help it work without overfitting. Next, some intuition for the infinite factor limit, which I found, of course, surprising on first reading. My sense is, let's remember that the final factor is the short rate. Our short rate at time t is the nth factor, the last factor at time t. It seems to me that as I searched for the intuition here, as n goes to infinity, each new factor is added at a very high frequency, kappa n, the logarithmic cascade, increasing those speeds of adjustment. strong reversion to the previous factor according to the time evolution. Thus, eventually, it seems to me the short-term rate does not change very much because, in a sense, with the very high kappa n, the last factor, which is the short-term rate, is tracking very closely to the previous one. Even though they share the same volatility, nonetheless, as n increases, they track each other. And so the noise tends not to explode, tends to converge. Just trying to give my intuition, not meaning to be a substitute for the detailed proof, of course, in the paper. Next, something about yield curve factor structure of the model. For this, I'm always interested in intuition. I'm always interested in what the yield curves look like. So what I did is I took a simple case, the three-factor model, as estimated in the paper, and I created a little spreadsheet. So let me sit down and put that to work for you here for just a moment. So just to have a little fun, I went ahead and tossed the three factors in here. And as you change those, it changes the yield over here, which is plotted over here. I don't care about that. Excellent. Okay, so we can go in and take a look at this third factor. Now, the third factor is supposed to be the short-term rate. So I can make it 1%, and indeed this jumps up to 1% right there, or 2%, or 3%, or 4%. Oh, by the way, when it was at 0, I wasn't flat, and that's because of the C term, the extra term that comes into the bond prices. Oh, by the way, I've used the price equation to back out the yields. So we're looking at interest rates as a function of time to maturity. It's important to know. So I'm increasing the very last factor, and that's controlling, as you can see. I've set it at 5%, and indeed the yield curve shows a short-term rate of 5%, exactly as claimed. It's nice to see that. I'm also seeing that that last factor has fairly short persistence. It tends to decay out quickly, again, as the model says. Let's look at the second factor. Now, that shouldn't change the short-term rate. Indeed, it doesn't. The short-term rate remains at 0 as I change that, and I get a sense of it changing the intermediate term behavior of the yield curve without changing the long-term yields very much. Again, very much as advertised in the model. And if I look at the first factor, which is the very long-term component, it tends to change the long-term behavior more than the shorter term. I like doing this because it gives me intuition, and that's what I'm trying to share with you about this. Now, also for intuition, I like to think about a three-parameter yield curve family as having three factors, a level, a slope, and a curvature, and I succeeded in sort of reformulating the space of 3 dimensions here so that if I copy these equations over to here, I can go up here and start messing with levels, slopes, and curvatures. So I've initialized it with my best approximation to a completely flat yield curve at 0. It's unable to get exactly flat. That's fine. I'm not worried. And if I change the level, you can see I can, within Laurent's model, here I've jumped it up to 5%, pretty flat there. I've got a slope parameter there. We're calling it a factor, slope factor here. So I've sort of backed these out by rotating the space of the original factors, just for the purpose of getting an intuition and sharing that with you. So you can change the level, you can change the slope, and you can change the curvature. As I do this, what we're trying to do is keep it at 0, same level, have it jump up but come back down. So it's not creating a slope, it's just changing the curvature here. And of course, curvature can be negative as well. So let's give it something interesting. 5%, slope of 3%, just to have a curve to look at. Okay, that was fun. I like intuition, and this helps me get a sense of how it is that your models can work so well. Because already the three-factor model is already capturing many of the features we expect of a good yield curve. And the fact that you're starting in a good place is consistent with the idea your 15-factor model is doing so very well. Naturally, I had to look at the Nelson-Siegel model and how it compared to that. Forgive me for wanting to do that. And so I created a little optimization so I can just tell Excel to go off and run the solver here. Are you going to bring that up? Did I? There's the solver. And I can tell you're looking at the Nelson-Siegel curve, one particular one, and I'm asking the solver to match the Laurent-Fisher-Wu model to that, and here it's optimized the minimum squared difference, basically. Doing a good job. At this point, I'm ready to move back to the general slides, and I've plotted for you the whole family of Nelson-Siegel yield curves from the original 87 paper together with their Calvert-Fisher-Wu approximation. You can see it has just the kind of flexibility that you want. This model is working quite well. From what I can tell, I'm not troubled by the 17 basis points difference. We know that we can go from 3 to 4 to 5 factors and decrease that, which obviously you have. Next, speculation and extensions. Very quickly, one additional parameter is what I might ask you to consider. Given the way this picture looks, I see this one is separated from all the others. And from my own intuition and work with yield curve shapes, I found that often taking a base exponential decay and applying along with it a linear combination of much higher decays tends to work very well. And so this is consistent with my intuitive picture of how these models can work well. So something to consider perhaps. I wonder about overfitting, even though you don't seem to be. I might suggest a cross-validation, leave some out test to help clarify, help strengthen the results. Could be illuminating. There is an issue of positive forward rates. Let me show you an example I created. Now we're looking at the prices. And I've created a system with positive interest rates that has negative forward rates. And the reason this can happen in an arbitrage-free system is the cash and carry arbitrage is not considered by the usual equations and the risk-neutral measure argument. And your cash and carry argument would say buy this maturity and just hold the cash. And that's an arbitrage that beats these prices. And finally, in 30 seconds or less, I've been working with linear price function models, and if I had a time machine, I would like to go 5 years into the future and see if linear price function models will or will not replace affine term structure models. And I believe Laurent-Fisher-Wu's model can be adapted and merged with these linear price functions. And that brings me in time, more or less on time, to the conclusion. Thank you, Laurent, Adlai, and Lurin, for a very high-dimensional, deterministic, dynamic term structure model that is parsimonious, that fits well, and avoids overfitting. And thank you all for your attention.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this insightful discussion. I think it gave us a lot of ideas for future research. I think you're right, we can have more flexibility by letting the kappa 1 be a separate parameters. It would be interesting to see indeed. Perhaps you stay at HEC will be the opportunity to see how we can merge this approach with the linear pricing approach. So I think we can get a lot out of this discussion. And I think we would love to have this Excel spreadsheet that you developed, if it's possible. Yes. Okay. Well, I will, since I have the microphone, I will close the conference. So, well, first of all, I'd like to thank those of you who have been presenting papers, discussing papers, presenting posters for being here today and for really being the blood of this conference. I'd like to thank all the participants, all the people who came, some of you from long distances to be here today. I'd also like to thank the HEC staff for all their support, in particular Claudine, the lady who you met downstairs. She's been helping us for about a year, right, to put this second conference together. Marcus, you heard him this morning, has been helping us. William Bench, who's a consultant at McKinsey, who was kind enough to spend the day with us to help us with the conference. But my biggest thanks go to my co-author and fellow co-organizer, Veronica. Many of you have probably realized by now that I've been shamefully free-riding on her hard work and organization skills. So if the conference has been a success, we should really thank her.
Please visit us at www.agc.edu.